Hi, and welcome to this episode of John's Model Kit Review. In today's fun modeling technique video, we'll talk about 3 ways to apply a mottled camouflage paint job to a scale model. I don't know about any of you out there, but I really like a model that has the mottled camouflage paint scheme on it. And modeling was typically done as a field applied camouflage. It's a finish that's difficult to replicate for several reasons, first of which there are really no templates for a modeling scheme. And while some are very uniform over the entire aircraft, some were really poorly done and it looks like 3 or 4 people were painting them at the same time on the same aircraft. Another aspect that can make these paint jobs challenging is the techniques used to apply them in the field. Some of these were brush painted on, some of these were sprayed with an air sprayer, and there's a lot of variation from plane to plane and sometimes even from wing to wing on a given plane. In this video, we'll be looking at 3 techniques to apply a mottled camouflage scheme to an aircraft. The first of which is using the traditional method, and that is using an airbrush. This technique is appropriate for aircraft whose modeling was sprayed on in the field. The second technique we'll be talking about is brush painting the mottled camouflage scheme. This technique is more appropriate for aircraft that were hand painted in the field. The third technique we'll look at is using pastels to apply the mottled camouflage. This is currently my favorite technique, and I'll get into the reasons why as we cover that subject. Up first, we have applying mottles with an airbrush. The first thing I did was spray the underside colors, and then I applied the topside hazel tan to this C202 from Hasegawa. Once that was applied, I used my Badger Anthem airbrush to apply the dark green mottles on this aircraft. This process was not a quick one. This is a process that lasted for me several days, and I had to walk away several times just because of my frustration. For fine detail work like this, spraying heavily thinned enamels is really the preferred method. Since I don't like spraying enamels in the house, even with my paint hood, I used acrylic paints for this. They were heavily thinned, and essentially what I had to do was just very slowly build up each model and continually clean the tip of the needle on the airbrush with a Q-tip that was dampened with thinner. And essentially, after each model was completed, I had to completely break down and clean my airbrush and then repeat the process. Once I had this completed, I had to go back over it several times with the hazel tan and spray where I had messed up a model and reshoot it. I'm very happy with the end result. I think the Mackie C202 is just a beautiful aircraft, and it really looks good in the mottled camouflage scheme. The second modeling technique we'll talk about is applying the models with a paintbrush. And I use this technique on a Hasegawa 1/48 scale Key 43. I've seen photos of the Japanese aircraft that were hastily hand painted in the mottled camouflage, and that's really what I wanted to try to replicate here. To do this, I use a fine paintbrush. And for the dark green paint, I thinned this heavily as well. And you can see on the outside edges of the model how the paint is somewhat translucent and you can see some of the silver coming through. That is the consistency that I wanted. And so I did the models very lightly at first, and then I went back and darkened the inner parts of the models. And it gives kind of a soft edge effect to it. Applying any mottled camouflage scheme is time consuming. It just takes patience to go through and be consistent on your paint job and to get it right. But I'm happy with the results on this kit. It looks really good. I think it looks like a hastily applied, hand-painted camouflage scheme. The third technique I'll talk about is applying models using artist pastels. For this technique, I use Tamiya's BF109E in 1/48 scale. And as you would imagine, this requires a set of the artist pastels. And to apply the pastels to the aircraft, what I use is a very closely cropped paintbrush. And this allows very nice control. It allows you to work in the color into the surface of the paint that's currently on the kit. As with the other techniques, I painted the base colors on this aircraft first and then applied the pastels directly to those base coats. The first step in this process is loading up the paintbrush with some of the pastel powder in the color that you want to use. Demonstrating on a piece of cardboard here, the next step is working the pastel powder into the surface of the kit. I use a fair amount of pressure here. You don't want to scratch through the paint, so keep that in mind. And when I'm done, there's some pastel dust and residue left over. What you want to do is remove this, but you don't want to streak it on the model. So I usually just blow that off with compressed air. The end result is a somewhat soft edge model, and you can go back and darken this as you like or reshape it. I really like this effect, and this is a technique I used on this BF-109. With this technique, you have to be very careful not to smear the pastels once they're applied. To keep from smearing the pastels, I would complete one section, say an upper part of a wing, and then I would clear coat that, and then I would move on to the fuselage, and then clear coat that. Once that was dry, I would go on to the next wing, apply the pastels, and then clear coat it quickly. I also highly suggest that you use some nitrile or rubber gloves as you're handling the model during this process. You'll be handling it quite a bit, and the oils from your hands can rub the paint off of the model. Another kit that I use the pastel technique on is Edouard's 1/48 scale BF-108 Typhoon. And if you look at it here compared to the 109, it has a much softer effect to the models themselves. And to achieve this, I use the same process that I had for the BF-109, but after applying the model, after blowing off the dust, I took an eraser and I went back over that model, and I erased it to the point where it was a much softer, much more toned down effect. I love the softer contrast that I can get, or the harder edge contrast, depending on what I want. I like the level of control that using the pastel technique allows me. Well, I'd love to know what you guys think. If any of you apply models with an airbrush, or with a paintbrush, or with the pastels, as I've shown in this video, please feel free to comment in the comment section below. As always, I hope you found this video entertaining and informative, and until next time, model on.